We now come to Phil Bird, who's the Interim Director of the Insurance Fraud Bureau, and he's going to talk about changing the public perceptions of fraud, which is something I think we discussed before the coffee break in great depth, but we want to see what the Insurance Fraud Bureau has to contribute on this.
OK, the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of my worst annual investment, glasses, because I can't read a thing on my notes without them. So we've heard a lot this morning about what the industry is doing to tackle fraud. So we've talked about application fraud. We'll talk about analytics, software later, no doubt. We have touched on IFB, and Bob Wishart will be here later to go through that. We touched on the IFR, and Richard Davis will be here again later to discuss that one. But I think without changing the public's perception around fraud, without getting to the root of that, changing their attitudes to that, we'll still be faced with a big problem. We all know the sort of numbers we've got. We've got a huge motor market, £10 billion plus. We've got a huge household market, £6 billion plus, with all the attendant tens of millions of policies. That's not touching travel, all the other personalised products, or even getting towards commercial lines. So the public are a huge stakeholder in our fight against fraud. David's touched on what the advantages of tackling fraud will be to the customer, and that's hugely important. They're big stakeholders to us. We know what some of the numbers are. We've touched on those. And Mark's £44 has gone up to £50 within 2 hours. So we have got a real problem. But there's some quite big consequences for the public in this. At the IFB, as you all know, we touch on the organised fraud component as the vast majority of our work. So the cash for crash is obviously a big thing to us. Big public safety question in it. We've seen the first incident of a fatality linked to a cash for crash claim. So it's not just about simple accidents at roundabouts, bump at low speed. This happened on a major road, hit from behind, moved into the hard shoulder to exchange details, hit by an articulated lorry. And that was the victim of that, not the perpetrator. So we've seen a public safety issue come right to the fore. There's probably more simple things that it hits. We touched on loss of no claims discount, high excesses. People suffer, genuine policyholders suffer from that. And what we also see very clearly when we're in our operations we're working on with the police is that a lot of this activity is funding other criminal activity. It could be firearms, drugs, a whole range of things. So there is a big public and society issue involved as well. What do the public feel about fraud? What's their attitude? What motivates them? What would deter them? All very important questions, many of which we've touched on so far. The ABI undertook some work, public perceptions work, published in 2010. And interestingly, 1 in 7 people said they would make an exaggerated claim. 1 in 7. However, only 1 in 20 would invent a claim. So there's a bit of a dichotomy there. There was also a further piece of research in there that talked about their attitude to the size of claim. So there's a very different attitude if the claim was up to around about £100 or so, where 13% said that they'd be very happy to kind of exaggerate a claim at that level, but at £1,000 they thought that was wrong. So there's almost like a threshold for the acceptability of a fraudulent claim. In that research, 80% understood policyholders pay for the cost of fraud, but only 8% would report fraudsters. And actually, a staggering 25% said if they knew there was a fraud, they absolutely wouldn't whistleblow. Now, That's 2010. In truth, since then, we've seen a lot more stuff come through cheat line. We saw growth in the number of calls last year by about 1/3. But whether that's just the mechanism becoming more available and better known, or actually that 8% now has grown to 10, 12, that's a piece of research that would have to be done later. But there's still clearly some very ambivalent views about insurance fraud. So, why do people commit insurance fraud? We've touched on some of those reasons earlier today, and I'll split out between what we see as organised crime and what we see as the opportunistic. And I think it's fair to sum it up that financial is behind the vast majority of issues behind it. But with organised fraud, it's an organised methodology. It is about financial gain. Whereas opportunistic fraud is really about mitigation. So in the organised arena, we're seeing claims worth several £1 million a time. Operation Exort, Bedfordshire Police, £5 million organised ring. As Mark pointed out earlier, the IFB have got just under 30 live operations worth over £60 million. So there, it really is about financial gain. Whereas in the opportunistic arena, people cite very different reasons. So it's really about mitigation. So people cite reasons around excess, premium levels, and at the moment we've got a lot of media interest that just focuses on the premium side, so what a surprise that the debate is framed in that context. People cite claims being for want of a better phrase, watered down, you know, the conditions applied, etc. So there is a distrust of the industry about the fairness of claim settlements, and people are very vocal about that. So there's a very different motivation between the two arenas. But what's quite clear, and I think we've heard it today, is that fraud, that insurers are seen as an easy target, and fraud is that mechanism to get at the insurers. There's quite a public perception of our industry, as I think we all know, and that therefore we become a legitimate target. So I think if we move on to deterrence, what are we going to do around that? People fear, again, that ABR research tells us that what people fear most of all is a police caution, a police conviction. They fear the consequences of that, what that might mean around potential employment records. It might mean around access to financial services. So that's a really terribly important thing for us to take away. And the launch of IFB is a massive piece for the industry in addressing that attitude. And the publicity that these guys are getting at an early stage, I think it was Andy said that the IFB have moved away from looking at organised fraud to looking at more opportunistic stuff. And I think that's an absolutely great thing, because it will get that message out to a much broader range of people. It'll get it out to both audiences. And there's a lot of work we need to work together on to get a public relations campaign around that and make that effective. I think the second bit in this for me is the insurance fraud register. So we've got all those that go through IFB, and yes, that's great, but the numbers are still going to be relatively small. The publicity impact would be great. The insurance fraud register is the next stage of that, and is the next stage of that deterrent campaign. That should launch, as we said, later this year. And around that, there needs to be a PR campaign that focuses not just on the delivery of the register, but what it means. So it's an education campaign about the consequences in particular. And that whole messaging around detection, around conviction, around access to insurance services will be really important. I think the other thing that comes around from this is actually getting people educated about what insurance fraud is. So we've talked about some of the things that people don't realise. Fronting, very common one. People don't realise that's a fraudulent act. But what we can't do is put into place things like the register and leave people to end up on that register potentially without actually educating them what fraud is. And that's got to be part of that whole campaign, that whole publicity campaign. And I think for me, there's also a part of it that will drive down the window of opportunity for fraudsters. There's a huge number of people, the ABI research told us there's a huge number of people that actually think you're never going to get caught. And that number was around 51%. Only 35% thought it was likely you'd get caught. So again, there's a lot of work to do on the majority of the population. And I think it's also very important around the messaging of that. We've got to be quite tough in that messaging. We don't want words like loopholes are being closed, the net's being tightened. This is about hard messaging, like the Irish campaign. It's not about easy message. It's hard messages about convictions, about what it does to your access to financial services. Just coming on to that Irish campaign, that actually started in 2003-04. And we've seen the sort of adverts that were coming out of that, hard-hitting messages, but there was also a lot of use of various media through that. So there was some panorama-style programmes, there was a lot of use of radio to get perhaps more subtle messages over around that the stakeholders and the people affected by fraud are not just fat cat insurers, they are people like pension fund operators who are hit by fraudulent claims, and the value's there. So there's some very important messages got over. And one of the things the Irish saw come out of this, one of the things the Irish saw come out of this was a spike in their cheat line equivalent. And that's a very important message for us, because it's a critical part that the industry has asked us to take forward, is to develop cheat line, to get better quality intelligence out of it, and that's a key activity for our comms team in the next 2 to 3 years. Over the last 3 years, we've had about 8,600 calls into cheat line, a third increase in the last 12 months. And that needs to continue. But we still have got this point that I made earlier, that there's not a lot of people prepared to blow the whistle. There's still only that 8% will be prepared to do that. There's also a question of, actually, do the public know anything about this? What's their knowledge of cheat line and how to get through to it, how to use it, what to go through? And there's quite a lot of calls. There's multiple calls to action in the public domain. We've got Crime Stoppers, we've got Action Fraud, we've got insurers themselves. But we need to plug cheat line. If that's our industry mechanism for doing this, we need to be prepared to plug it. And I would call on all of you to be looking at things like displaying the IFB cheat line buttons on web pages, cheat line details on renewals, and so on. Because that's the only way we're going to get through. So that kind of leads me towards my personal pleas for 2012. So we want to continue a high visibility of fraud in the media. We've got a number of PR campaigns planned around application fraud, cash for crash, fronting, ghost broking. All that type of stuff is ongoing, and that's a really critical one that we keep going. We're talking to a number of media companies about TV documentary exposures, and doubtless we'll be talking to members about that as we go on. We've got to focus on the effective deterrence. And we've talked about that, so there's no need to go over that, but I think we know what the messages look like there. We've got to educate consumers and dispel some myths around the insurance industry, that it's there, it performs a vital service to the buying public in times of stress, unfortunate real events that people go through, and dispel some of the myths around the ease of committing fraud and some of that stuff that we've talked around about consequences, hitting the IFR and so on. And as I've talked about, enable whistleblowing. And at the moment, the industry vehicle for that is cheat line, so we need to go through that one. And the PR campaigns have got to go hand in hand with all the other activities we're doing, because I'll come back to my first point. The public are a massive stakeholder in this, and we've got to get to grips with the way they think, because that will make all your efforts doubly effective. Otherwise, we won't be deterring the fraudsters and getting to where we want to be. Thank you.